Israel is hosting diplomats from 4 Arab countries and the United States in what has been called a historic meeting. The Negev summit has just wrapped up, and the message from Israel's foreign minister was better ties with Arab nations so as to deter Iran. Yair Lapid met foreign ministers from the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt and Morocco. Lapid said they would work together to create a new security architecture to counter common enemies.
This new architecture, the shared capabilities we are building, intimidates and deters our common enemies, first and foremost, Iran and its proxies.
As we do, we have to be clear that these regional peace agreements are not a substitute for progress between Palestinians and Israelis. One of the issues we discussed today was how countries involved in the Abraham Accords and normalization, as well as those that have long-standing diplomatic relationships with Israel, can support the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people in concrete ways and have a positive impact on the daily lives of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza.
For more on this, we can bring in Arise US Correspondent Rotimi Kade. Rotimi, thanks so much for joining us on Newsday. Tell us more about this summit and why it's been labeled as historic.
Well, a very good question. It's called historic because for the first time in many years, Sunni Arab countries and Israel are closing ranks against a common enemy, Iran and its proxies, from getting a nuclear weapon while the U.S. plays the role of an arbiter. The meeting also is meant to essentially get assurances from the U.S. as the nuclear talks with Iran is likely to resume, not to give in to Iran's nuclear demands as conditions to actually halt its ambitions. Israel, on the other hand, does not actually fancy U.S.'s role in resuming the talks in the first instance because it will give Iran, according to Israeli foreign minister, an unfair and undue advantage as U.S. prepares to leave financial sanctions if the deal actually pulls through. So U.S. officials have warned that Iran is just weeks away from getting enriched uranium from a bomb, and Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, actually argued that an Iran without a nuclear deal would be even of a greater threat to the region, even as Israel is likely to strike Iran's nuclear facilities if diplomacy actually fails. So essentially, this historic meeting is to find a common ground.
And what role, if any, can the U.S. play in trying to restart the peace process between Israel and Palestine?
Well, the U.S. has been playing a bigger role for decades now between the two countries. And the U.S. said that they believe in two-state solutions, which means Palestinians and Israelis living side by side. And that policy, irrespective of past administrations, hasn't stopped. Antony Blinken made it very clear that the Biden administration will pursue that agenda to make sure that Palestinians is recognized as a country and live side by side with Israelis. But in the past few years, under the former administration of Benjamin Netanyahu, we've seen occupation in the West Bank, which of course was not part of the agreement. And we've also seen the rise of Islamist party, which of course is in charge of the Gaza Strip. There've been a lot of meetings and to foster solution between the two sides, but obviously as a result of what's going on right now, the Iran nuclear deal, Ukrainian crisis, U.S. under this administration have not been able to more or less galvanize their agenda, their proposals to seeing how they can lessen the tension between Israeli and Palestinians. And this is a big challenge on the foreign policy promises of the Biden administration in ensuring that there's some level of peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Arise US correspondent Rotimi Kade, thanks so much for joining us on Newsday.